Ready to kick your character into high gear effectiveness by adopting a class loadout? Well, watch on, cause I got you covered. Hey there, my name is Salendrak and welcome back to another episode of my Terraria version 1.4 Journey's End Beginner's Guide series. I've hinted at it in the past, and today we're finally going to be talking about classes. What they are, how to use them, as well as the pros and cons of each class's playstyle. So without further ado, let's get to it. So what are the classes? Well, there's just 4 of them, and they are Melee, Ranged, aka Ranger, Magic, or Mage, and Summoner. Whether or not you are playing as a given class is determined based on the type of damage dealt by your weapon of choice, especially if you have armor and accessories that boost or otherwise complement that type of damage. So if you're swinging a sword that deals melee damage, and have armor and accessories that boost your survivability and or melee damage so you can get up close and personal with your enemies, then you're playing the melee class. Similarly, if you're wearing armor that increases the number of your summoned minions and are mostly swinging a whip as your primary weapon, then you're playing as a summoner. Now in the early game, it's really not necessary to focus on any particular type of weapon damage or view yourself as being of a particular class. You can use anything and everything you have available and are definitely encouraged to experiment to find what works best for you. And in general, it's always a good idea, regardless of what class you're playing as, to keep a good melee weapon on hand to beat away enemies if you're getting swarmed, and to keep a good ranged option on hand so you can take out enemies from afar. And once they become available, every class can benefit from having a minion and sentry to give some added DPS. Again, there's no rules as to what you can or can't use, so it's a good idea to focus on overall utility and keep a variety of options on hand to meet the needs of whatever situation might arise. In general, you can do perfectly fine in pre-hard mode as a classless character using whatever you want, mixing and matching weapon types to your heart's content. But as you get further into the game, it is definitely a good idea to specialize your loadout to increase your overall effectiveness. Once you get into hard mode, where class-based armor sets become the norm, you'll generally want to focus on one specific class at a time, mixing in additional utility items as needed. So with all that theoretical stuff out of the way, let's dive a little deeper into each of the specific classes and talk about their features, pros and cons, and what type of playstyle they bring to the table. For gear recommendations, I'll focus on pre-hard mode considerations, but will later mention a few resources that list many more options and cover progression throughout the game. And do note that this video is meant to be a general overview of each of the classes, rather than a detailed guide about any particular class. For specific recommendations about what weapons and gear to use at various stages of the game or against specific bosses, be sure to take a look at videos I've made and will continue to make in the future dealing with those topics. So, starting things off, we have the Melee class, which is a great place to start if you're first learning to play Terraria. Throughout the game, it generally has the strongest defensive characteristics and survivability, decent damage output, and a pretty wide variety of weapon types and effects. Although the prototypical melee weapon is the simple sword swung at close range over your head, the class also has a wide variety of reach out and touch someone weapons to defeat your foes at a distance. Yo-yos are great at focusing on specific targets at medium range and can even go around corners. Boomerang and flail type items can also cover a pretty decent distance, and especially in hard mode, there are a number of items that shoot melee damage projectiles, some of which even home in on your enemies. The overall playstyle of Melee is pretty forgiving, and as compared to the other classes, you'll be the most able to take a few hits and live to tell the tale. On the armor side of things, you'll want to focus on high defense in the early game, and when able, damage boosting armor set bonuses. As soon as you can, put together a set of tier 3 or tier 4 metal armor, and then step up to your evil biome armor set, and then work towards getting the molten armor set as soon as possible, which is hands down the best pre-hard mode armor set in the game. Weapon-wise, auto-swing swords are great, but if an otherwise decent weapon doesn't have auto-swing, you can avoid developing carpal tunnel syndrome by using the Feral Claws accessory found in the jungle. Yo-yos are great secondary weapons that give you ranged and targeted DPS, Though if using a yo-yo as your primary damage dealer, you'll want to consider using a string accessory to increase the range, and a counterweight to provide multi-target damage and more area protection. Later on in hard mode, these can be combined with the hard mode yo-yo glove to make a yo-yo bag, allowing the humble yo-yo to be a great weapon to use throughout the game. As you progress through Terraria, you should also experiment with other options that you find along the way. Flails are great at piercing through multiple targets, but can be tricky to aim at airborne targets and leave you vulnerable if the flail is out and returning. Spears are also pretty good at hitting multiple targets and generally have pretty good knockback, but don't provide as much area protection as swords or flails. When playing as melee, I generally like to have at least 2 or 3 of these different options available at a time to give greater flexibility to address a wide variety of situations. Keeping a good gun or even a homing magic weapon on hand is also a good idea, as is a summoned minion and sentry. Later on in hard mode, you'll have access to an even wider variety of weapon effects, including AoE explosives, fast and far-reaching projectiles, homing missiles, and powerful armor sets. For accessories, there aren't a ton of options in pre-hard mode. I've already mentioned feral claws for auto swing and the string and counterweight for yo-yos. Beyond that, a cobalt shield from the dungeon or its upgrade, the obsidian shield, will make you immune to enemy knockback, and you can add a magma stone for some additional fire damage. The rest of your accessory slots should be focused on mobility items like speed boots, fledgling wings, and double jump items and their upgrades. Melee is a lot of fun though, great for beginners and veterans alike, and overall a very strong option, especially when you're first learning the game. It will struggle against certain bosses, especially on higher difficulty levels, so feel free to switch to a different primary weapon and setup if you're having trouble downing a boss. Which brings us to the next class, the Ranger. Enjoy the playstyle of killing your enemies before they can get close enough to kill you? Then the Ranger class may be right up your alley. Master of reaching out and touching someone, the Ranger generally has higher DPS than melee, but at a cost of slightly lower defense and generally less crowd control. In the early game, you'll be limited to thrown weapons and bows with a variety of different arrows as ammunition, but once you've ventured into the jungle and found a boomstick or smashed your first Crimson Heart or Shadow Orb in your evil biome, you'll have access to the arms dealer for some more options, as well as musket balls for gun ammunition. Throughout the game, you'll need to purchase or craft your ammo, and you'll definitely want to keep an eye on your inventory to make sure that you don't run out of ammo in the middle of a boss fight. There are only 2 armor sets that boost ranged damage in pre-hard mode, namely the Fossil Armor, crafted from sturdy fossil obtained from the Antlion Desert, and the Necro set, crafted from bones from the dungeon and cobwebs. Before getting either of those sets, you're fine just using any ore set or your evil biome armor set. There aren't really any Ranger-specific accessories in pre-hard mode, and very few are available in hard mode, so you'll generally want to focus on boosting your mobility and survivability, and as they become available, incorporate general stat and damage boosting accessories. Throughout the game though, the Ranger is one of the best boss hunters available due to its ability to focus on single targets at a distance. Because let's face it, there are a lot of bosses with whom you do not want to get up close and personal. Most of your projectiles will fire in a straight line, though depending on the ammo, you may need to account for arrow drop with bows. Later on in hard mode, you'll have even more options, including bows that rain death down from the sky, bullets that seek out their targets, darts, rockets, and even ricocheting ammunition that can fill an arena with bouncing projectiles. Remember to add in a summoned minion and place sentries for added DPS, and if you find yourself frequently running out of ammo, you may want to stockpile ammo reservation potions and place an ammo box in your base and fighting arenas. Also, because most range weapons have little or no knockback, it's a good idea to keep a high knockback sword handy in case you get swarmed by mobs in cramped quarters, such as exploring caves or the dungeon. But all things considered, the Ranger playstyle is a lot of fun, and it's very effective at killing pretty much any boss in the game. If variety is the spice of life, then the Mage is the curry of classes. Compared to other options, magic weapons by far have the most variety of effects. Although initially you'll only have access to simple projectiles, you'll quickly expand your repertoire to heat-seeking weapons, bouncing ballistics, delusions of death, and even swarms of suffering. And in hard mode, you'll get even more crazy options. As far as damage output, the Mage is hard to beat, but this does come at a cost. Throughout the game, the Mage generally has the lowest survivability stats, and you'll also have to take care to manage your mana and keep mana potions on hand. Mana regeneration potions are basically a must-have for boss fights, and there are also a variety of mana boosting accessories throughout the game you'll want to look into. Armor-wise, you can get your first set of magic boosting robes pretty early in the game by making a basic robe out of silk, and then combining it with 10 of any color of gem, diamond being the best, followed by ruby and amber. Complete the set by adding a magic hat obtained from a rare cavern level mob named Tim, and you'll have a fairly decent early game damage boosting outfit. There's also the jungle set, the meteor set, and if you can snag a mystic robe from the traveling vendor, the highest pre-hardmode mage set comes from combining the mystic robe with the wizard hat and a set of meteor leggings. Because there's so much variety in magic weapons, it's definitely a good idea to experiment with the various options to see what works best for you. It's also a good idea to keep a couple of options on your hotbar, as some weapons are better for single target while others are great for putting down a crowd. As with the ranger, it's also a good idea to keep a mana-free sword on hand for when something gets up close and personal. Just be sure to keep your distance from your enemies as best you can, and then put down your foes with style. The fourth and final class in Terraria is one that is hard to get going as there aren't a lot of good weapon options available in early pre-hard mode, and that class is the Summoner. Compared to the other classes, the Summoner takes a less direct approach to killing enemies. Rather than taking them head on, the Summoner instead relies pretty heavily on summoned minions that do your dirty work for you. In pre-hard mode, you'll still have to do a lot of the work yourself as you won't be able to get more than a handful of minions out at once. But later on in hard mode, your minions will do all sorts of heavy lifting, allowing you to sit back and watch the mayhem. The first weapon you're likely to find in most worlds is probably the Finch Staff found in living trees. You also might get lucky and have a Slime Staff, but it has a really low drop rate. So if you want to go Summoner and don't find either of those two options, your next best bet is to farm the furry Flinxes of the snow biome and make a Flinx Staff. And you can get an early Summoner robe by crafting the Flinx Robe. This is a one-piece item, so in the early game you'll want to use whatever head and leg armors might support whatever other weapon you might be using, or simply go for higher defense from Mind Ore or Evil Biome armor pieces. Once you've been to the jungle and taken out the Queen Bee, you can put together the Bee armor for a nice boost to minion capacity and damage, and once you've gotten a Hellforge from the underworld, you can put together the best pre-hard mode summoner set, the Obsidian armor set, which boosts your minions and significantly boosts your whip damage and range. And speaking of whips, these melee feeling weapons are not to be scoffed at, especially with the Obsidian set and a pair of Feral Claws, as this allows the pre-hard mode summoner to do a lot of damage. The whip hits all targets in their range, but at reduced damage against multiple targets, and will tag what they hit, causing your minions to do even more damage when they hit the tagged enemy. So keep those whips handy and enjoy the havoc your minions will cause to all your foes. Like the mage, the summoner generally has much lower defense, so do your best to keep your enemies away from you. As with the other classes, it might be a good idea to keep a high knockback melee weapon on hand in case something gets too close for comfort. Also be sure to mix in sentry weapons, and in hard mode, you'll be able to take advantage of a wide variety of accessories that will further boost your minion and or sentry limit, as well as damage. And there you have it, the 4 basic classes of Terraria with some tips on how to get started with each during pre-hard mode. But what if you're already in hard mode and really want to optimize your loadout? Well, there are a couple of excellent guides on the wiki that I personally refer to all the time to get ideas on what gear to equip at varying stages of the game. Links for each is down in the video description, and they can easily be found on the wiki. The first is the Class Setups Guide that lists a variety of options for all classes throughout the game and includes weapons, armor, accessories, and even buffs. It is very worthwhile to experiment with the different options, particularly weapons, to find what works best for you. But in general, the recommendations in this guide are pretty spot on, making the guide a great resource when you need fresh ideas of what to try next. The second guide that I refer to all the time is the Armor Progression Guide. This one is far less subjective than the Class Setups Guide, and instead lists various armor set options for each class based on the stats. Most stages of progression will include a couple of options in case you want to focus on, say, raw DPS versus balancing DPS with survivability or max defense, etc., etc. It's basically another great resource focused exclusively on your 3 armor slots, and definitely worth taking a look at if you're either dying too fast or not killing things fast enough. And that's pretty much all I've got to say about classes at this point. As noted earlier, and as I've done in prior boss guide videos, I will continue to give suggestions of gear setups that I find to be particularly effective for each class against each boss, but for general exploration and gameplay, the guides on the wiki really should be a place that you check regularly. Also, did you know that I live stream Terraria as well as other games? Be sure to check my community page for my schedule, which is updated each week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!